Chris, we've been having so much nominative determinism on Newscast lately.
Yes, so I hear.
So we had Phil McCann reporting on petrol a few months ago. On Wednesday's episode, available on BBC Sounds as a podcast, we had an item about how much caffeine is in coffee from our health correspondent, Catherine Da Costa.
Right. You know what? I listened to that and didn't actually the penny didn't drop.
Oh, did you not then get my joke when I said we're then going to get an item on the price of bricks from Chris Mason?
Bricks.
And I've even got like a little prop for you so you can get into the zone, a little hard hat.
You're talking about bricks, I assume you mean Brazil, India, China. Who were the other ones?
Brazil, Russia, India, China. Yeah, in economic terms. Anyway, so bring us some construction news. Chris Mason's construction news.
So this is about inflation and the cost of bricks from the National Federation of Builders. These numbers quite surprised me, actually. A brick costs between 70p and £1.20, but that's quite a big rise. It was about 40p to a quid this time last year. If you want a 3-bed semi-detached house, you need between 7,000 and 8,000 bricks. So even at the upper end of inflation, your 3-bed semi, it's only costing about 10 grand for the bricks.
Wow, there we go. And if you've spotted any other BBC correspondents that could be reporting on their own name, let us know. Newscast at bbc.co.uk.
I'm thinking about Adam Fleming now, but I can't think of.
I mean, phlegm, like winter cold season. Right, on with this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And Chris in the studio.
And we will be joined in the studio by various people from various places. Although actually one of them is Andy Burnham, Mayor of Manchester, who, spoiler alert, is going to be in Manchester.
And Justine Greening, who is a former Conservative MP and did almost every job in government when she was there, will actually, be in the studio.
No, I don't know about you, but I love reading a Bank of England monetary policy report. They meet every so often and they make decisions about interest rates. And today they put up interest rates again by 0.5 percentage points. So it's at 4%. And the last time they were there was, middle of the financial crisis, 2008-ish?
Yeah.
And they also say that they're going to stay about that level for quite a long time. So this idea that this high interest rates are here to stay, that idea is here to stay.
Yeah, and so their sort of big picture sort of message is not great, it's pretty bleak, but they're kind of saying things might not be as bad as as had been predicted.
Yeah, and that's where the graphs come in, and we're now going to try and paint graphs with words, but they looked at inflation, which they do in all these reports, and actually what they're suggesting now is that inflation will fall faster than they were predicting when they last did this back in November. Now, politically, that helps out Rishi Sunak because it shows that his first pledge of halving inflation by the end of the year is comfortably on this trajectory going to be met.
Yes, and there'll be those who will say, well, obviously lots of people will say hurrah to that. As far as the politics of that is concerned, there will be, as there was when he announced this promise, a slight scepticism because the extent to which he is actually responsible for that is questionable. Although Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, was making the point in the context of the strikes that, ensuring that wages aren't contributing too much to inflation is important. Of course, you could move quite a bit from a government perspective on the payment of those who are striking without it being inflation busting.
And the other graph from the Bank of England today is about the coming recession, which they say will be shallower and shorter than they were hoping for. And again, that means Rishi Sunak's going to meet his second pledge, probably, which is that the economy will be growing again by the end of the year. Although I do just wonder, the economy still looks pretty stagnant and flat in the next year, and that's got its own problems. Slightly different from the economy shrinking, but still doesn't mean that you can then do loads.
Quite, and you look at the predictions ahead as far as the economy is concerned, and looking at the graphs today from the Bank of England, you get to 2026 before the economy is back to where it was before the pandemic. So just that sense of flatlining, not really, no sense of economic growth, and then what that means, obviously for businesses, for households, for the tax take. So even though some of this stuff isn't as bleak as others have predicted, or indeed has been predicted in the past, it's still pretty grim, really.
Let's talk about some of this stuff with our first guest on this episode of Newscast. It's former Conservative MP Justine Greening. Hello.
Hello, Adam. How are you?
Well, you know what? I've just been making my list of all the jobs you did when you were in the government. Former Education Secretary, former Minister for Women and Equalities, International Development Secretary, Transport Secretary, and Economic Secretary to the Treasury.
I know, that was quite a lot.
So I ask you about literally everything that's happening in the country right now.
It was a great mix because I got to do Treasury, I got to do domestic briefs, and I got to do an international brief. So I really saw government from every side, apart from being in the whips. But other than that, yeah,
well,
whole spectrum.
And when you look in now, having done that range of government jobs, and governing is always difficult in any circumstances, but perhaps particularly at the moment for all the reasons that newscasters will be familiar with, do you envy the people who are there, or do you sort of fear for them? I mean, this is a tough time to be trying to deliver government, basically, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always difficult. So back in 2010, when we'd had the great financial crisis, we were that far away from the kind of crisis we had last October, had we not got our finances into shape. I think there are always challenges. And the thing I learnt from all of that was you just have to be so laser focused on what your priorities are, because there are always going to be headwinds that are trying to blow you off course. And if you don't know where you're going in the first place, you're absolutely stuffed.
What do you think about Rishi Sunak's 5 priorities? Because the first 2, according to the Bank of England today, will be quite easily met. Inflation is going to plunge and the recession is going to be shorter than people thought. I mean, is that good to have those as your top 2 priorities if they're easy? Quote unquote easy.
I think he's got his 5 priorities. I think they are clear and people can form a view on whether they're ambitious enough. I think the challenge and the key thing is actually the priority that people set this government was levelling up, and it won a landslide back in 2019 on actually a very clear mandate. One was getting Brexit done, and people will obviously form a view on whether they feel that's happened by the next election. But the second was levelling up, and yes, there are these headwinds, whether it's the boats, whether it's the challenge on the economy that crop up in the meantime. But fundamentally, this issue of levelling up is the one that this government will absolutely have to have some really good answers on for the electorate come election day.
And you're suggesting that they don't yet?
I think that the more they are distracted by what are inevitably difficult challenges, the challenges that we've seen around various people in the cabinet, whether it's Nadhim Zahawi having to resign, or the issues and the inquiry around Dominic Raab, I think the more distracted people feel they are from the levelling up agenda, then the harder it's going to be for them to make genuine progress on it. Because I know from my time in government, these things do take up your time.
But isn't it too late though? Because the next election is probably going to be in 2 years, and in Whitehall time, that's a nanosecond if you want to make a big change.
Well, yes and no. It's remarkable how a 5-year term of Parliament runs away from you if you're not careful.
I guess particularly if you swap prime ministers every 5
years.
But
particularly if you have 3 prime ministers during that time. But on the other hand, there is the Levelling Up White Paper. It set out 12 missions. So there's an architecture there for government to get on with. You could do a Queen's speech around how those missions are going to be delivered. Not all of them will even need legislation. I remember I set out a social mobility strategy within the DfE. We didn't need to pass a bill. And
Education Department.
Not everything needs a bill through Parliament. The question is, can you actually get on with delivering those 12 missions that this government set out a year ago now?
So we saw the Prime Minister hurtling around England the other week talking about levelling up. He went to Morecambe, he went to Gateshead, I think, and various other spots. You seem to be suggesting that, he's not doing enough or doing enough quickly enough. Is this because this was a Boris Johnson project and are you suggesting that Rishi Sunak's sort of heart really isn't in it, or...?
No, I think it's just a complicated agenda that no government's ever really managed to get to grips with and has lots of different elements to it. So, for example, we do need to do much, much more on education. I've got a huge amount of respect for Gillian Keegan. I think she's actually a really good person in that role, and she understands, as I did, just how important education is for being able to get on in life. But I think, obviously, we've got the strikes that are happening at the moment, children losing more time out of school. There's a real question in my mind about whether we've got the level of ambition we need to not just catch up those gaps that opened up in COVID, but to close the ones that were already there. And it's those sorts of things that really make the difference, I think, on levelling up. And, of course, this wider agenda on it, which I work on day in, day out, which is to get employers engaged. This sense that even if you close all of the gaps that open up in the education system, if our labour market, if our employers and businesses aren't open to that wider talent pool, then we're still not really going to connect people up to opportunities in the way that we want to.
Few things there, but I think the first neuron that's fired there in my brain is when you then see things like when you talk about corporates, like the big corporate story today is Shell making these bumper profits bigger than they've ever done before, and then everyone goes tax them more. If you're trying to get business to be more socially minded and invested, literally invested in like the social fabric of the country, but then people are opening their newspapers or listening to the radio and going, oh, those fat cats. I mean, what does that do to your mission?
Well, I think it underlines that we need to have a much more broad-based strategic relationship with business than just tax. The role that business plays in Britain is far more than just the revenues that are contributed, but people haven't always seen that. And so for some of the companies that I've been engaged with, really going to different universities to take their graduates, you've got them pushing their apprenticeships into social mobility coal spots, like UK Power Networks. Most people may or may not have heard of it, but now genuinely thinking, well, if we've got our apprenticeships and we're scaling them up, what do we need to do to make sure they can go into some of those communities where they'll really make a difference? So this sense that every single opportunity an employer has can change your life for the better. And have our employers really thought as carefully about how much they do as actually they could? And so I think a lot of businesses are starting to think about that. Of course, in the energy sector, there's a huge amount of investment going on. You look at what BP's doing, for example, in Teesside, a massive opportunity to drive levelling up that it's thinking much more clearly about now, perhaps, than it ever would have done, looking at very different universities, looking at apprenticeships and all of that. And I actually think the big challenge for government is to sort of keep up with it in a way. So education needs to reflect the fact that what employers are looking for is a much broader skill set and talent than just academics. But to what extent is our school system really focused on developing that broader skill set that they will want to get when they leave school?
Well, that's what you want the theme to be in education, but the theme in education at the moment is teachers not feeling that they're paid enough and that they're overworked and the conditions they work in aren't great and that they want to go on strike in historic, epoch-defining numbers. Do you think the government has just mucked up its relationship with the teaching profession? Because you were very proud when you left office that you'd sort of patched it up a bit.
I always try to get on with everyone. I've never really been somebody who was in politics that felt there was merit in not having a relationship when it was there. And I certainly never wanted to be in a situation where I had a conflict with the unions because we simply hadn't understood one another. So I think having those discussions and talks is absolutely crucial. I think right now the priority is probably to at least agree a process by which you could start to find a solution. You've got the pay review board happening. That's probably a structured way in which you could, with some evidence, start to work out this trade-off between essentially what the government's saying, which is affordability, and what the teachers are saying, which is cost of living.
Let's cut to the quick here. Your hunch is that teachers should be paid more given where inflation is.
I think you can't buck the market, Chris, and therefore if you look at recruitment levels, which have been persistently under what we need, if you look at retention levels, which are also a problem, and if you look at then the fact that private sector pay is running ahead of public sector pay, and the risk is that that problem gets even worse over time, it has to stay competitive. You're not setting pay rates in a vacuum. That's just, well, it's just a fact. And the answer as to whether it's a yes or no, that's why you have the pay review board. These are really difficult trade-offs to make for both ministers and I guess also unions about what's the right way to deal with this. But actually, it is a balance that needs to be struck, and sooner rather than later, because we don't want kids out of school anymore.
Chris, if I can just ask you, Justine mentioned the allegations of bullying against Dominic Raab. I'm not sure what's actually happening there. Is it that there were more allegations against him, or we're just learning more about what the original allegations were? I'm a bit confused.
I think what we've got here is that because we had all of the story about Nadhim Zahawi, the now former Conservative Party chairman, and him being sacked at the weekend, there has been a tilt in the news focus towards the other ongoing, if you like, ticking time bomb in a human resources sense for the government, because there's this inquiry led by a senior judge into Dominic Raab and these allegations of bullying that we should emphasise Mr. Raab denies. And because the process is ongoing and this evidence is being gathered by this KC, as we now call senior lawyers, very few people are willing to talk publicly about it, but a lot of people are talking privately to journalists and others about their experiences working for or with Dominic Raab, some positive, some negative, and that's what's sort of generating quite a bit of attention. I think it could still be quite a long way off before we get this whole process concluding, because the process of assembling all the testimony and then a report being written and then it going to the Prime Minister could take some time, and I suspect quite a lot of it might be redacted. The old black marker pen will go through a lot of it before it sees the light of day. So that's kind of where we are. But speaking to people, it looks like there are at least a couple of dozen of complaints from individuals that have gone in, some of them packaged up as an individual complaint, but involving more than one person.
I'm not going to say anything on this because last episode of Newscast on a Thursday night, we were talking about the ethics advisor reporting on Nadeem Zahawi, and you said, everyone's hoping it's going to be quite quick. And I was like, oh, these things take a long time. It happened on a Sunday morning at 7 o'clock in the morning. Justine, what do you think about these allegations against Dominic Raab? And also, presumably, as a former education secretary, like bullying is it's like the worst thing.
Well, so when you were talking about the sort of human resources piece of it, I was thinking, going back to saying I was never in the whips, I always used to say that the whips were like a human resources department with the human bit taken out. Right. I think it's interesting because in a weird way, what I'm saying is there probably isn't enough focus on that aspect of people in politics. And I mean, obviously, it's just another thing that this government doesn't need, a sort of slow drip, drip, drip of stories about people in cabinet and whether they are fit to be in those roles. And I guess I'm like everyone else. I don't really know the ins and outs of the Dominic Raab affair and what's gone on. I do feel like the inquiry is taking a long time, and that the longer it takes, almost the worse it is.
So what should Rishi Sunak do in this situation? Because on the one hand, the politically expedient thing might be to you fire Dominic Raab because you think this is a problem, we'd sort it out, irrespective of what the allegations amount to, and he denies them, and you get it off the front pages and off the news bulletins. On the other hand, he and Downing Street made the argument, look, this is about due process. This is about assembling what has happened, giving people who want to share their testimony with a lawyer the chance to do that, and then we have a process, arrive at a conclusion, and then a Prime Minister can make an informed decision rather than one based on, people whispering things in Westminster corridors.
Well, there's three routes, aren't there? Either you decide you're going to fire that person because you think, I know this isn't acceptable to me, or they resign, or you have due process. But in a sense, you've got to take that decision at the beginning. And it's hard to start off on one of those tracks and then change.
Did the Prime Minister make the wrong decision at the beginning?
I genuinely don't know in the case of Dominic Raab, because I genuinely don't know what the allegations are, if you like, and to what extent there's already substance.
Sure, but there's a political expediency element, isn't there, which would be blow him out the door, and then you don't have the oxygen of the government taken up.
And that's
by
why it's interesting you said there's three choices there, because quite often the middle road of let's have due process is presented by the decision makers as not making a choice, but actually it is a choice because you're allowing it to continue.
Absolutely. And of course, at the time he was making his choice in relation to how to deal with the allegations on Dominic Raab, probably didn't realise that the issues around Nadeem Zahawi were going to blow up. So, yeah, they're all tough decisions. That's what being in government's like.
Why is it in politics there are more of these things than in any other workplace, it seems? Or maybe just other workplaces, we just don't hear about it. But...
Because you have to get virtually all of them right. And I remember Ken Clark saying to me once something along the lines of, well, you get 95% right, doing rather well. But people...
Hang on, are you actually a really good impressionist? Who else do you do?
I'm not doing any more. I've been known to do it.
You must do Boris. Oh, okay.
Only Boris Johnson, actually.
Let's hear your Boris Johnson.
No, I'm not.
Would you like, talking about distractions for the government, would you like Boris Johnson to maybe stop getting on planes and going and doing interviews in America and speeches about things and popping into Kyiv?
I think he just likes to he's just going to see his fan club, isn't he, really, and get a bit of love back. So I think that's what's going on with him.
Justine Greening, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, lots there on levelling up, the government's signature policy. But levelling up is kind of the bread and butter of I don't know, the mayor of a big city in the northwest of England, like Greater Manchester, like Andy Burnham, who's here. Oh, well, not here, but in Manchester. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Adam. Hi, Chris.
We haven't caught up for a while, so this is nice to speak to you. I was chatting to Len McCluskey on the last episode of Newscast, and he was saying Keir Starmer needs to do more to be on the side, show he's on the side of ordinary people, and maybe some of his support for striking workers has been a bit lukewarm lately. What's your take on that?
Well, I think anybody on the front bench in Parliament has obviously got a different job to do than the likes of somebody like me. So I understand that, but I think they are showing real support, and that's good to see. I think the issue is that you've got Labour saying, sit down with people, listen to them. They're having real trouble with the cost of living crisis. These are our kind of the people we clap. These are people we should be supporting. And on the other hand, it would feel as though the government are kind of seeking this sort of political confrontation with the unions for their own purposes. So I don't know, it feels increasingly to me that there is a very clear difference between the two main parties, and one side is trying to support people who are struggling and the other doesn't seem so.
You talked there about the desire, and we've heard this articulated by Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, for the Labour instinct would be to get people around the table. But the thing I struggle with whenever I speak to your colleagues here at Westminster, or indeed Labour voices around the country, is the answer to the next question, which is then what? So, a Labour government gets people around the table, striking workers, the union representatives around the table, and then what? Is it your instinct that the striking workers who are demanding more pay should be paid more, even if it is less than inflation, some sort of increase on what they're currently offered?
I've said that all the way through, Chris. A solution needs to be found because we are still in an exceptional financial year where inflation has been very high. You can't leave people without support to manage that. The way I see it is this, for people whose job it is to keep other people safe, so people who work in our hospitals or who attend other people's homes should they have a fire or a crime, whatever it might be, those people can't be worrying about their own home when they're going out to work, because that's simply not
So
not
how do you
fair.
pay for it? How do you pay for that pay rise?
You find a way, don't you? There are reserves in the NHS left over from the pandemic. I've talked about a one-off payment all the way through this to recognise the exceptional pressures of this year. But you also need to reward people properly so that we don't end up paying a huge amount, for instance, on the agency bill in the NHS. And this isn't me sort of like talking as though it's an easy luxury thing for me to say. I have the situation where I'm trying to find a solution for our firefighters. I think they have had a raw deal, years of real terms pay cuts. It is incumbent on us to help them.
Andy, you mentioned the firefighters in Manchester. That's one of the services you're responsible for as the mayor. But the Inspectorate of Fire Services said that they could do with some improvements in their effectiveness and efficiency. Are you tackling that? And is that a sign that maybe you didn't look after the fire service enough?
Well, no, if you might remember, Adam, there was obviously big issues revealed with Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service a couple of weeks after I first arrived in this role, following the attack at the Manchester Arena. And ever since then, we've been putting Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service on a path to improvement, and they are improving. The regulator has said that they're not fully yet where we want them to be, but they are well down that path, as are Greater Manchester Police, actually. Greater Manchester Police, released from special measures, also improving. The reality is both of these emergency services have been hit by cuts that we saw a decade ago, and that's had an impact. But they are definitely both now on a journey of improvement, and that's something that we're very proud of here in Greater Manchester.
Talking about devolution, there was this thing last week called the Convention of the North, which sounds a bit like a Game of Thrones convention, if you ask me. But it was actually a very interesting kind of set of workshops about devolution. Michael Gove did a speech there, which actually sounded like it was
marching south. We're not marching south just yet, Adam. We're giving you a bit of time to come up with some better solutions. But no, it was a really great event, actually. It's a positive event, I'm joking. The North is coming together across political lines, across geographical lines. We're increasingly speaking with one voice, and a positive voice. But actually, I think it is getting noticed in Whitehall and Westminster, because we've never done that before. And I think there's a new resolve here that things aren't going to be as they've always been. where we just kind of get treated as a kind of second-class sort of group of people, and we just get told what to do, and we have to just get on with it. That's come to an end. We're not going to have that anymore. Everyone's really clear about that. And we're now kind of in a more confident, more assertive position, saying, OK, we want to play our part in bringing growth to all parts of this country, but that means Whitehall, Westminster, you've got to change the way you've always treated us.
Now, I've got to ask you about the Battle of the DJs. This event back in December, I think it was. Now, what was this? You and Angela Rayner, the Labour Deputy Leader, and Steve defeated Steve Rotherham, the Metro Mayor of the Liverpool City region. Tell us about this. How do you win some sort of DJ off?
How? Well, by having better music. That's how. The Eurovision capital can be. We're quite happy for them. That'll bring visitors to the Northwest. But obviously, it keeps our reputation as the home of cool music, and we're comfortable with that here in Greater Manchester. But no, these are two great musical powerhouse cities, as well as obviously being footballing and sporting powerhouses. And we Steve and I like to celebrate our culture and everything that we're about. And it was actually a great night, to be honest. And the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party was undoubtedly the star of the show.
Are you gutted that Eurovision didn't go to Manchester?
No, I gave you the reason just now, Adam. We're as I say, we're cool music here in Greater Manchester.
Although I noticed,
know that, Adam.
Although I noticed
we don't do cheese. We'll leave that to others. Yeah.
Although I noticed Beyonce is not coming to Manchester on the UK leg of her world tour. Cardiff, Edinburgh, Sunderland, and London.
Well, as I said, cool music.
You've just dissed Beyonce. I don't know if that was wise. Talking of music,
probably not.
Yeah, exactly. You're gonna have a load of Beyonce fans coming after you now. Talking of music, though, you've got a little slot though on BBC Radio Manchester where you have your artist of the month. I don't think we know February's yet. But who was January's?
Brilliant! It's such a good thing, to be in a city like ours where there's all of this talent coming through. I think we do trade a bit on past glories, if we're being honest with ourselves, our musical past. So I've kind of launched this Mayor's Artist of the Month. Takes inspiration actually from the great Tony Wilson, who you might remember often used his slot on Granada Reports to promote bands and use whatever platform he could. So we're kind of saying, well, hang on, isn't it time we start promoting the music of now? And so our first winners announced last week, advised by our Music Commission, the KTNA. Twins from Blakely, Manchester, born in Kenya, but very much doing R&B with a Manx twang, which is absolutely fantastic. So, really proud that they're our inaugural Mayor's Artists of the Month.
I think we've got a little clip, haven't we, of Summer Never Dies by the KTNA. Summer Never Dies in Manchester in January, Andy.
Summer never starts.
The next single's going to be Rain Never Stops, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Andy, thanks for joining us virtually from Manchester. Hopefully see you in person soon at some point.
You're welcome. You will. Cheers, Adam. Cheers, Chris.
You got a ticket to Beyonce?
No, because after trying to get Madonna tickets, I don't want to go through that process again because it's nerve-wracking.
Is it sort of hanging on the phone or refreshing a web page?
And quite expensive. Right, thank you for listening to this bargain basement. Very good value, almost as good as going to see Beyonce or Madonna in a stadium duetting episode of Newscast. Bye.
Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.